So I just want to begin by saying thank you so much for inviting me to be part of this. I'm completely out of my depth, but I am learning a tremendous amount. I'll just plunge into it. There are definitely pretty tight connections between some of what I'm going to be talking about and what Kristen was talking about, but I won't try to spell that out as I go along. So the debate about animal normativity largely concerns whether non-human animals have specifically normative attitudes. Do they think of or do they experience their own behavior and that of others in terms of what's right or wrong, or in terms of what they ought or ought not to do? Many researchers have argued that the capacity for normative attitudes is specific to humans on the grounds that normative attitudes require sophisticated cognitive capacities. And typically, evaluating behavior in normative terms is taken to require grasp of rules or recognition of reasons for doing things in one way rather than another. And both of these seem to require the capacity for language. This line of thought excludes the possibility of normative attitudes in both animals and pre-linguistic children. In this paper, I won't take a position on whether animals can have normative attitudes, but I do want to argue for the possibility of normative attitudes in pre-linguistic children. And I want to do so by arguing for a distinctive kind of normative attitude, which doesn't presuppose grasp of rules or recognition of reasons. And this kind of attitude corresponds to a distinctive kind of normativity, which I've labeled primitive normativity. I've argued elsewhere that we need to invoke this kind of normativity for purely theoretical or a priori reasons. We need it in order to make sense of our capacity to grasp concepts and to use language meaningfully. But I also think that we can find indirect evidence for this kind of normativity in the behavior of children in the early stages of language learning, and that's what I'm going to be talking about here. Now, my approach is similar to that of many researchers who argue for the possibility of normative attitudes in animals. I want to argue that it's possible to recognize one's own or others' behavior as appropriate or inappropriate without having to be able to formulate rules with which the behavior accords or fails to accord, and without having to be able to recognize reasons why it should or shouldn't be done. But unlike these defenders of animal normativity, but the kind of normativity that I want to invoke in order to make this point is different from that typically invoked by the defenders of animal normativity. And in particular, I don't think that the relevant norms count as social norms. Rather, I think that the normative attitudes I have in mind are a condition for being able to recognize social norms. This is part of what makes my approach different from the kind of approach that's typically been invoked in connection with animals. So Kristen defends what she calls naive normativity, which she invokes in connection with a range of candidate norms in chimpanzees. And she talked about these norms in her presentation just now. They include norms which have something of a moral flavor, like the prohibition of infanticide and the avoidance of inequities. But there are also norms that are associated with specific cultural practices. For example, norms for using tools in a specific way, the norm about entering a community and eating their specific kind of food, even if that's not the most advantageous thing, norms for sharing food, norms for who get to copulate with whom, and norms about behavior towards elders. And she argues that, she argues that recognition of these norms, I'm sorry, I'm trying to handle two documents simultaneously. Kristen argues that the recognition of these norms doesn't require grasp of language or the capacity to reason. It's enough that the animal has the following four capacities. The capacity to identify other individuals as agents, sensitivity to differences between individuals who are part of the in-group and individuals who are part of the out-group, a capacity for social learning of group traditions, and a responsiveness to the appropriateness of behavior paradigmatically an ability to register or manifest awareness of norms having been violated. We're going to see in section 4 that the kind of normativity that I'll be arguing for doesn't require the second or third of these capacities. It doesn't require sensitivity to who's in the in-group, who's in the out-group. It doesn't require a capacity for social learning. It may require a capacity to identify other individuals as agents. I'm not sure about that, but it definitely does require the responsiveness to appropriateness. So I want to turn now to looking at some studies of categorization behavior in human children under 3, which I think illustrate the sort of normativity that I want to highlight. So there's a series of studies that were carried out beginning in the mid-1960s and which has to do explicitly with categorization. And it looks at what's called the spontaneous sorting that children carry out when they're given objects of different kinds and just allowed to play with them. And the first of these sorting studies was conducted by Henry Ricciuti in 1965. And he reports that he undertook these studies because he was doing kind of formal categorization tests with children. And he noticed that 3-year-olds who failed to exhibit categorization behavior in response to the explicit instructions he gave them would then sort the test objects quite systematically when they were just playing with them spontaneously or when they were asked to put them away. So he started to conduct these studies, and many researchers subsequently have carried out similar studies, and there's lots of references at the end of the handout. The studies that I'm most interested in from this group were carried out, hang on, let me just move the handout down a little bit. Oops. The studies that I'm most interested in were carried out with children between around 12 and 30 months. A typical study involves presenting children with a randomly arranged array of 8 small objects of 2 clearly demarcated kinds. So for example, in the original Ricciuti study, these were 4 gray balls and 4 yellow cubes, or 4 blue dolls and 4 green boats. You get the results are basically the same, whether or not the objects within each subgroup are identical. So Gopnik and Meltzoff came up with the same results when they used 4 pencils of different sizes and colors and 4 different rings. Now, even if they're given no instructions and no adult or nobody models the behavior for them, children starting at around 12 months will typically move the objects around so that objects of the same kind are put in the same location. And studies also showed that there was a precursor behavior, sequential touching, where starting at the age of around 9 months, children will successively touch objects of just 1 or 2 kinds. There's variations of this kind of study which have adults presenting children with arrangements of mismatched objects. So the experimenter puts on the table 1 group with 3 dolls on a boat, another group with 3 boats on a doll, and children starting at 21 months or earlier will correct the classificatory mismatches. They will switch the objects around so that objects of the same kind are placed together. And so on the handout, I give just an indication of the ages at which children carry out this sorting at various levels. The classificatory mismatches might start as early as correcting the classificatory mismatches, might start as early as when children are a year old. A lot of children are doing it at 21 months. And by the time that children are 2 years old, almost all the children do what's called exhaustive sorting. So that means that they move all 8 objects and they end up with all the objects sorted into 2 groups of 4 objects each. Now, the children in these studies appear, hang on, I just need to do something with the handout. So my interest in these sorting studies is different from that of the researchers who conducted the studies. So the researchers were primarily interested in how successful children are at sorting different types of objects at different ages. And they were also interested in things like, do they sort by color? Do they sort by shape? And Gopnik and Meltzoff were also interested in how spontaneous sorting correlates with early word learning. And I will talk about that more in a moment. But my interest has to do with something different, namely the attitude with which the children appear to approach their own sorting activity. From the descriptions that the researchers give of the various sorting activities, one gets the impression that at least starting around 18 months, children doing the sorting take a normative attitude to what they're doing. We see this most clearly when the children are old enough to use normative expressions. So Jonas Langer and Susan Sugarman, in separate studies, they report instances of this in children at 30 months who use explicitly normative language especially when they're given the mismatched objects. They say things like, no belongs this way, not good in there, no, they're not on properly. And at least if we take this language at face value, the implication seems to be that they see what they're doing when they're moving the objects around as making things right, or they think of themselves as doing what we should. But younger children too behave as though they take a normative attitude to what they're doing, and Langer and Sugarman describe what they call self-correcting behavior. So an example of a child hesitating over where to put a spoon, placing it partway in a container which already holds a spoon, and then saying no and placing it in a different container. And then at 15 months, again, another example of self-correction, which isn't accompanied by anything verbal, but it seems like from these sorts of examples that the children aren't just moving the objects around, so to speak, mechanically, but thinking about where to put them, that is, where they should put them. Now, I want to move on to a second set of studies, which I think also have to do with categorization and that also show similar normative attitudes. And these are studies which explore children's reactions to adults calling familiar objects by the wrong names. One of these studies was conducted by Roy P. on children between 18 months and 3 years old. He would show them familiar objects like a car or a ball, objects whose name the children already knew. And then he would say things like, that's a ball, when he showed them the car. Starting at 18 months, children would say no, and around 2 years, they would elaborate with not ball or no car. Some of the 2-year-olds were more explicit in their correction. So for example, when the experimenter said of a dog, that's the pussy, the child would say, no, doggy, that's the pussy, pointing to the cat. He also found something which he said was unexpected. Beginning at age 2, some of the children responded to the experimenter's false labeling by themselves calling familiar objects by the wrong names. So a child pointing at a ball says, that's a garden. A child touches a cat and says, there's the doggy, touches the dog and says, there's the catty, and then, according to P, laughs uncontrollably. And then a child looking at a biscuit says, it's a door, it's a star. P doesn't say how old these children were. They could have been anywhere between 2 and 3. But there's another study by Koenig and Eccles that looked at responses to false labeling in younger children. Now, Koenig and Eccles were interested not in the responses as such. They were interested in whether there's a difference between how the children respond to adults who are looking attentively at the objects and doing the false labeling, and adults, how they respond to just the label coming from a loudspeaker or coming from an adult who's not looking at the object. And they found that there is indeed a difference. Children react much more strongly if they hear the name coming from an adult who's looking at the object. But what interests me is the fact that the children protest. So they found that children protest the false labeling and attempt to correct it. They say no, or they try to give the correct name. They shake their heads, or they wave their hands. The experimenters also described the children as showing what they call distress when they heard the false label from the attentive speaker. So, for example, the children were sitting on their parents' laps and the parents were wearing sleep masks so as not to be able to influence them. Many of the children would turn around and try to pull the sleep masks off their parents' faces. And the children who didn't know how to produce the correct name apparently made efforts to correct the adult anyway. So when the adult said, "That's a shoe," while looking at a cat, almost a third of the children in the study, to quote the researchers, cleverly pointed to their own shoe. Okay, now again, my interest in these studies is different from that of the researchers. I'm interested in the fact that both sets of studies seem to show children taking a normative perspective, either on their own activity or on an activity they observe. But the children at least seem to think that there's a way that the objects should be labeled and the way that the objects should be sorted. I also see a closer connection between these studies, and here I'm drawing on a suggestion from Gopnik and Maltzow, who think of the early use of names as itself a kind of categorization behavior. As they put it, a name places some of the objects in the world into a particular group. And if this is right, then we can see the children's behavior in the false labeling studies as of a piece with their behavior in the spontaneous sorting studies. For example, we can think of the 2-year-old who responds to the experimenters labeling the dog as a cat by saying, "No, doggy," and then pointing to the cat and saying, "That's the pussy," as like the 2-year-olds in the Sugarman and Langer studies who correct classificatory mistakes. This 2-year-old is doing the equivalent of moving the objects around, putting them in what she thinks is the right places. And similarly, the child who calls the cat doggy and the dog pussy while laughing uncontrollably is enjoying putting things in what he recognizes to be the wrong places. And that example is similar to that of a 2-year-old whom Gopnik describes in her study of children's use of non-nominal words. So this is a little boy who several times completed one of those jigsaw puzzles where you have to put the pieces in the same shape spaces. And now this child takes each piece and deliberately places it on top of the wrong space, saying "there" each time he does so. And this strikes him, according to Gopnik, as hysterically funny. If this is right, then both sets of studies have to do with children's sorting behavior, with sorting construed in a broad sense as something that can be done by putting objects of the same kind in the same location, or by attaching a verbal label to them. And both sets of studies again suggest that the sorting involves a normative dimension. The child typically thinks of herself as putting the objects where they should go, and so as conforming to a standard of correctness. And this is what makes possible the amusing experience of occasionally putting things where they don't belong, or, which I take to come to the same thing, calling them by the wrong name. The kind of normativity I've identified here, what I should say is, my point in this section has been to identify a kind of normativity that doesn't depend on language mastery. But I want also to note that this normativity not only doesn't depend on grasp of language and concepts, but seems to be a condition of it. So as I see it, the child acquires the concept of a ball or a cube in part by coming to see that balls belong with other balls and that cubes belong with other cubes, where belong with means that it's appropriate to sort them together or that they should be sorted together. Relatedly, the child acquires the capacity to use and understand words like dog or shoe in the context of genuine assertions or questions through recognizing the appropriateness of these words to the corresponding objects. And I've suggested that this is of a piece with recognizing how the objects should be categorized. Now, I want to move on to the question of whether this is a form of social normativity. I actually thought this was a controversial question, or would be a controversial question. What Kristen suggested in her talk when she was giving the example of Day, she seemed to assume that, no, this is definitely not a form of social normativity, but I've often had people arguing that it is. So I have some discussion of that point. I claimed at the beginning that the normativity isn't social, and that the relevant correctness doesn't, in other words, that the relevant correctness doesn't amount to accordance with a social custom or practice. And I argued that this differentiates it from the kind of naive normativity identified by Andrews. The child doesn't recognize that the ball goes with the other balls and the cube with the other cubes because she's learned this from the example of others' behavior. She sees the ball as to be sorted with the other balls, or thinks that it should be sorted that way, independently of what she's observed adults doing with balls of that kind. She may never have even seen a ball of that kind before, let alone seen it being manipulated by an adult. And yet she takes it that this is where it should go. So this suggests that the recognition of this form of normativity doesn't depend on the second or the third of Kristen's 4 criteria for naive normativity. Children don't need to know who is in or out of their social group in order to know which things should be sorted together. And they don't need to be able to learn from the example of adults. It seems to be something that they recognize spontaneously. This isn't to say that children at this age don't have these capacities. It's just to say that they're not essential to recognizing the particular kind of normativity that figures in these activities. To clarify this point, I think it's useful to compare what I'm calling primitive normativity with the kind of promiscuous normativity that's been revealed in recent studies of 3-year-olds by Schmidt and colleagues. This is work that builds on earlier work by Riccocci, Warneken, and Tomasello. In these studies, children saw an adult performing an unfamiliar action on a novel object. For example, pushing a block with a special kind of stick. It was a stick with a suction cup on the end. And the children who saw this action immediately appeared to infer that this exemplified a norm, even if they just saw the action being performed once. For if they were then shown a puppet performing a different action with the block and the stick, in particular, putting the stick on the block and then pushing the block directly with the stick on top of it, they would protest that the puppet was doing it wrong. So it might seem, they would say things like, that's not how it goes. So it might seem that the kind of self-correcting or other correcting behavior I identified in the categorization and labeling studies, when the child says to the experimenter, no belongs this way, while correcting the mismatching, it might seem that this kind of behavior illustrates the kind of normativity that Schmidt talks about, which is genuinely social. Now, I do think that this is at least possible in the case of the children in Roy P's study who find it funny to call things by the wrong names. And I think here there may be an element of appreciation of social normativity of this kind. The children in these examples may be conscious not only of categorizing wrongly, but in some sense of violating specifically social expectations. But I don't think this is the case for the other kind of behavior I've described, particularly the spontaneous sorting. And also, I'm not convinced that it's the case in the labeling studies. I just want to consider it as a possibility. And this is for 2 reasons. The first is that as I've already suggested, the child who puts the ball with the other balls rather than putting it with the cubes isn't doing so because she's observed an adult's behavior with balls and cubes and is trying to follow the adult's example, as in the case of the behavior in the promiscuous normativity studies. The child doesn't seem to need a specific human model for the particular behavior being carried out. And the second point, which I think is more fundamental and more philosophically interesting, but also potentially more controversial, it seems to me that the child's taking the puppet to go wrong when the puppet pushes the block directly rather than pushing the block with the stick, arguably presupposes a more basic capacity to categorize the relevant kinds of behavior. So it arguably presupposes a capacity to recognize one episode of pushing a block with a stick as being of the same kind as another episode of pushing a block with a stick, and as being of a different kind from an episode of pushing a block directly. The idea that the puppet is doing something wrong seems to depend on the antecedent and more basic idea that the puppet is doing something different from the adult. And so it seems to depend on the child's antecedent recognition of different kinds of behavior as calling to be categorized in different ways. The recognition of primitive normativity, which I'm trying to highlight, is already involved in that antecedent recognition of how different kinds of behavior are in effect to be sorted together. I want to suggest that this recognition is similar to the recognition that one block belongs with the other blocks and one stick with the other stick, and it's less sophisticated than the recognition or perception of the puppet as violating a norm about how to behave with blocks and sticks. So I finally, this isn't really part of the paper proper, but because this is a workshop about animal normativity, even though I'm talking about small children, I do want to end just by raising the question of whether animals can recognize the kind of normativity which I've tried to identify. Since I understand language mastery in the true sense to be limited to humans, I don't think that there can be any kind of a priori argument to the effect that non-human animals must be able to recognize normativity of this kind, although I think that we maybe can make such an argument in the case of pre-linguistic human children. But that doesn't rule out that animals might be able to recognize normativity of this kind, and I'm really interested in the answer to the question whether they can. So far, I haven't done a lot of reading and thinking about this, and it would be wonderful to hear what suggestions you all have. But I've come across just two pieces of relevant data. The first is a series of studies by Giovanna Spanozzi and colleagues, which show that some primates carry out spontaneous sorting in a way similar to human children, and that the spontaneous sorting also develops along the same pathway as in human children, but that they're just more limited. So for example, the tests that were done with chimpanzees involved just 6 objects rather than 8 objects, and the chimpanzees could sort together a maximum of 3 objects at a time. They rarely do exhaustive sorting, and it's not until they're 5 years old that they are able not just to separate out one class of objects from the other, but simultaneously move both lots of objects around to make 2 distinct groups. The experimenters don't provide enough description to determine whether the sorting has the same features that make it plausible to ascribe normative attitudes to small children. So they don't say enough to determine whether there's apparent self-correction, apparent correction of others, careful examination of the objects before placing them, and so on. But I would love to know more about this kind of behavior in animals. And then the second piece of data is the example that Kristen gave in her presentation of Dede the orangutan, which Kristen talks about in a 2015 paper. So this is the orangutan who apparently corrects an experimenter who's trying to get her to arrange jackfruit seeds and coconut shells so that one seed goes in each shell. And Day insists on instead putting the jackfruit seeds together in one shell. And this seems like the kind of evidence which could support the attribution to animals of the kind of non-social normativity which I'm trying to defend. And I would be eager to know if anyone could suggest further evidence of this kind.